Hi, everybody. And hopefully everyone can hear me. Welcome to the second Brulium Wines virtual tasting. Thanks everybody for being here. It's super heartwarming to see so many familiar names and so many familiar faces out there and so many pups as well. And hopefully we'll get another baby like we did last week. So if we can maintain puppies and babies and then next week invite some rainbows and some unicorns, then it sounds like we'll be in good shape for happy things ahead. I'm going to start with some basic housekeeping. So we are recording this. Last week, we had a number of people request a recording of what happened. And because it was the first week, I wasn't sure I wanted to save a hot mess for posterity. But it did go well, so this is being recorded and will be reposted in some capacity, maybe on our website or on some sort of a hosting service for us. Let's see. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes. And as you know, the focus is going to be on Chardonnay. And last week, we spent a good amount of time introducing everybody, which was a ton of fun. But I'm delighted to have so many people here. So I think maybe I'll just ask two people with video cameras to share what they're drinking. And why don't we start with you, Mike, out in Texas. Brian's going to unmute you. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what you brought to the virtual tasting?
Okay, well, first of all, we opened a bottle of the Torrey Hill Pinot Noir 2017 for dinner.
Nice.
And we really are still enjoying it. It's really nice. But we've also got the Heintz Chardonnay as well. So we are ready to go.
Awesome. Kudos to you guys for opening one bottle per person.
Wait a minute. I didn't say I was sharing.
Awesome. And then I think Lorraine Jarvis is out there. Lorraine, I saw your name. So Brian's going to unmute you and maybe you can share with us what you're drinking.
Okay. Hi, Lorraine Jarvis.
Hi there. Hi, Lorraine.
Hi. I'm in Windsor. I'm actually right around the corner from Kerith and Brian.
Yeah.
And I as instructed, I don't know if there are rules, but I am drinking the Brulium Chardonnay.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks for your support. And hopefully you got a good bike ride in today with all the sunshine.
I did a really amazing hike. I don't have to tell you where, Kerith. It's super top secret.
Okay. I'll take it from you. All right. And last but not least, I don't know if they've logged in yet, but my friend Jen and Tom are supposed to be logging in from Illinois. And I heard from somebody that it is Tom's birthday. So on the count of three, I'm going to ask Brian to unmute everybody. And we're going to go 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday, Tom. Okay. So can you unmute everybody? Okay. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday, Tom. All right. Well done, guys. Okay, well, it's been am I unmuted? Okay, we're good. So it's been a really long week. I'm sure everybody is tense and full of anxiety, and my heart goes out to anybody who's been directly affected by COVID. I know we have some healthcare professionals out there too, so thank you for all your service. And because it's been such a hard week, I thought I would, get out my bottle of wine here and uncork it and have a little drink myself. Speaker view. I also have to remind everybody to please click the box in the upper right-hand corner to put this into speaker view. And so I'll wait for you guys to do that. And we'll get going in earnest. So like a lot of you, I've opened up a bottle of the Heintz Vineyard Chardonnay because we're talking about Chardonnay. And a lot of people asked me, why did you decide to make Chardonnay? And for a long time I resisted. But Chardonnay is very much a natural pair with Pinot Noir. Both love cool climate sites. And of course, Burgundy is the holy grail for Pinot Noir and a lot of people for Chardonnay too. And since both those grapes are planted together there, it seemed like a natural progression that I would move into Chardonnay as well. For a long time, I joked that I wouldn't make any Chardonnay unless I could get Rocchioli fruit from the Russian River Valley. And that seemed like an awfully high bar. So I sort of, buffered myself from the challenge of Chardonnay. And of course, Brian being the CF no, it took him a while to get on board with any project too. But we can sort of fast forward to an event called World of Pinot Noir. That happens every year. And this was probably in 2013 or 2014. And Brian and I are at our table pouring next to another lady and gentleman. And this woman is a tall blonde woman, and she looks over at me pouring wine, and I look at her pouring wine. And she says, "Oh, you have a family winery." And, you know, I'm busy pouring for all these people because I think I'm hot stuff, and I'm, you know, not being as polite as I should be. And I said, "Yes, we have a winery." And she says, "Oh, well, we make wine and we're growers." And at that point, I was technically a grower too, because we had Torrey Hill Vineyard, you know, the mighty 1 acre vineyard that is our estate fruit. And I said, "Oh, well, I'm a grower too." And I said, "And I'm a mom." And she said, "Oh, well, I'm a working mom too. You know, we're growers, winemakers, and I have kids. How many kids do you have?" And I look at her and I said, "I have 3 kids." And she looks at me and she goes, "I have 3 kids." And I was a little taken aback. And I said, "Well, I have twin girls and a son." And she looks at me and she goes, "I have twin girls and a son." And at this point, like, the coincidences were ridiculous. And I said, "Well, my twins are 9. And she said, "My twins are 9. Well, fast forward, I bet you can guess that I was standing next to Karen Heintz and Charlie Heintz of Heintz Vineyard. And it turns out that, yes, indeed, they have twins, Madison and Samantha, and their twins, and my twins, Lily and Amelia, have all been in school together for the last 4 years. So it's double trouble, double twins. But I just think that story points to the power of small family wineries and being in a small grape growing community, which for me is what I love most about making wine in Sonoma County. So now that I shared with you a little bit of my Chardonnay story, I thought maybe we would talk a little bit about the Heintz Vineyard specifically. And Brian's going to pull up the big AVA map. So we're going to start really broadly, and then we're going to get a little bit more granular. So here, of course, we have the big AVA map that some of you guys saw last week. Charlie Heintz's ranch sits sort of near that dot that says Occidental. And his ranch is interesting because it crosses the AVA line. So his ranch is partially in Sonoma Coast and it's partially in the Russian River Valley. So you're allowed to bottle it as either, depending on your style. This is a family ranch. It was established by his great-grandparents in 1916. It's a 100-acre property, and they grew Zinfandel for a very long time until, you can guess, Prohibition. At that point, they switched over to an apple orchard, and they farmed apples out there until 1982. And why don't we switch to the smaller map, the small map now, which I think says map number 2, Brian. So now you can sort of imagine this superimposed on the map we just saw, and you can see that star that says Heintz. The first modern grape growing started at Heintz Vineyard in '82, and Charlie and Karen took over farming the grapes in 1984. They have about 25 acres of Chardonnay, 20 of Pinot, and 2 of Syrah. So they're relatively old vines. They're kind of spaced far apart with a split canopy, which is unusual to see in Sonoma County. And it's got the classic Gold Ridge rich soil that's famous in the Green Valley. And now why don't we switch to that Charlie map? And here we go. So it's planted to clone for Chardonnay. And when I first started making Chardonnay, it was in advance of the 2017 vintage. And I said to Charlie, "How do I find my rows when I get there?" And he said, "No problem, I'll draw you a map and I'll tape it to the trailer." And this is literally the map that he drew me in 2017. And I love it because it lists all of the rows. And you can see down in the bottom that Costa Brown has 8 Super T rows. And in the back corner, you see Ted, that's Ted Lemon from Literai. You can see William Salem in there. And you can see Heintz has their own vines right in the middle, and Freeman, Akiko out there, and McCrosty. So like all the other vineyards that I source from, this is an allocated vineyard. And this map is from 2017. In 2017, I just sort of snuck in under the radar getting Chardonnay. And my fruit came from the back from Ted Lemon's block, where he has 7 rows. And Charlie was able to get me, I don't know, I think it was just over a ton from Ted's block. And if Charlie were to make me a new map for 2018 or 2019, you would see that I now have my own Broulium row. So I should actually get him to make me an updated map. The other great thing about Charlie and his Chardonnay program is that he delivers the fruit to you literally himself. Do you want to pop up that picture, Brian? So Charlie has a bunch of old cars on his property, to the delight of my dad, who loves to go and deliver bins with me on the auspices of being helpful, but he really just wants to shoot the shit with Charlie. So Charlie and my dad walk around the vineyard while I haul all the picking bins off the back of my dad's pickup truck. And then Charlie comes when you're ready to get your grapes, and he shows up in his custom painted Peterbilt. And it's just such a delight. He comes and he unloads everything himself, and it really, again, speaks to the camaraderie and the warmth that you see in Sonoma County. All right, back to Brady Bunch mode. So a lot of you guys know me from doing Pinot Noir because I made red wine and Zinfandel for so many years. So I thought it might be fun to talk a little bit about the ways that making Chardonnay or making white wine varies differently from making red wine. And obviously that starts with the color. And this is review for most of you, but obviously when you're making red wine, you're fermenting on the grapes and on the skin. And in contrast, when you're making white wine, we take the fruit, we deliver it to the winery, we still sort it. It goes up this little escalator. It gets dumped into the press, and we press the wine, and all we keep are the juice. And then the skins and the seeds, they're discarded, they're used for compost, and we separate that juice and ferment it off the skins and the seeds. So that's obviously the big, big difference between making white wine and making red wine. For me, I make a barrel fermented Chardonnay, which is very much a stylistic choice. And theoretically, if you're fermenting everything in a barrel, you're going to get ongoing micro oxidation, right? Because as everybody knows, wood forgives, right? And it's not impermeable to oxygen. We know that it expands and contracts. So you're always going to get that steady, slow ingress of oxygen over the course of fermentation, which is helpful, and over the course of aging as well. So when you ferment in barrels, it's also good to remember that you only have a little tiny hole at the top of the barrel in contrast to a large open top tank. And that really has ramifications when we're talking about the alcohol content. So when you're fermenting any kind of juice in a small container, the amount of alcohol conversion is higher, not because the conversion of sugar to alcohol is necessarily at a significantly different ratio, but it has to do with the evaporation of alcohol and blow off that happens in an open top tank that you're not seeing when you're fermenting in a barrel. And obviously fermenting in a barrel, it's a little bit harder to control temperature. A lot of times we talk about the tank temperature is this and the tank temperature is that, and we turned on the glycol to get things cold, or turned on the glycol to prevent things from getting too hot. You obviously don't have those stop and go mechanisms when you're fermenting in a barrel. So for me, making Chardonnay that's aromatically driven, I really want to keep those temperatures low and moderate. So I'll start fermentation in the cold room, and then I'll take it out to the warm room to get it going. And once it goes through that exponential phase of fermentation, I put it back into the cold room so it doesn't get too hot. And then at the tail, I might move it out again into the warm room to get it to finish and give it some of that roundness. So it's a lot of forklift driving, and it's not a very technologically complex way of temperature control, but it's the best way that we have to do it with the barrels. And then of course there's issues of heat and cold stability. So both of those are important when you're making rosé, when you're making white wines, because you want them to be sparklingly beautiful and you don't want any hazes. So one way that we can stabilize any white wine or rosé wine for heat stability, so we don't get a haze, is we use something called bentonite. It's a clay. And you typically mix it with water, and it takes a lot of elbow grease to get it to suspend into the water. Well, being as I love to cook, I had this great idea that I could use my Cuisinart immersion blender, because sometimes in the winery, we do use hardware for mixing up big buckets of yeast. You know, we might use something that whips attached to a drill. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if I just use what I use for soup at home? So I'm at home and I'm mixing up my bentonite and I stick in my Cuisinart and it starts whirring. And I'm like slowly adding the bentonite into the water. And my Cuisinart stick starts to get really hot. And then I start to smell this terrible burning smell. I actually blew out the immersion stick doing bentonite at home. And so, you know, I had to take the thing out and I just let it sit. I'm like, well, fine, it's got to settle for 24 hours overnight anyway. The next morning, the thing was like paste. It was a bucket of cement that I couldn't even use. I had to call my friend who's a winemaker, Julia, and I called her with my phone on FaceTime. And I said, oh my God, Julia, I ruined the bentonite. What do I do? And I literally could invert one of those 5-gallon buckets that you get at the Home Depot, and I inverted it and the stuff was stuck inside. And she said, don't fret, you just need more water. So apparently I did such a great job mixing it up. It went from a usable slurry into flat out cement, but it turned out okay in the end. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Chardonnay styles. For me personally, I really like white Burgundies from France. And those have a pretty distinct palate imprint. When I was lucky enough to visit Burgundy, Brian and I obviously drank a lot of wine. And for me, the delta or the distance between California Pinot Noir and Pinot Noir coming out of Burgundy was not that great. I thought maybe there would be this moment of revelation where there's something they're not doing that we do, or vice versa. And I think it's very winemaker dependent. We had people whom we met in Burgundy who inoculated and people who did native fermentation. I met winemakers who did 100% whole cluster and winemakers who destemmed everything. But for me, I really saw a big difference between California Chardonnay and white Burgundy. And that could be very biased. It may be that at that time, my palate was just more attuned to the things that I had access to, you know, more of the Napa style of Chardonnay. At that point, I didn't have as much access to cool climate Chardonnay, but I just remember being really struck by that and loving that palate imprint. So really loving Chardonnays that were zippy, that were acid driven, that were bright, that were food friendly, that you could pair with scallops with lemon sauce, that you could pair with risotto, that you could put with chicken saltimbocca, that would be great with like prosciutto on top. And that was really the style that I was leaning towards. And that also brings me to one of the really fun points that I love about Chardonnay, which in my opinion, Pinot Noir really tastes like where it's growing. Chardonnay winemakers have a lot of tricks in their back pocket that allow us to shape the Chardonnay into what we really think we want it to be. So if you want a buttery Chardonnay, we have tricks that can get us to that place. If you want a really toasty, coconutty kind of Napa style Chardonnay, we know the kind of barrels that you can use with toasted heads that will lead us into that flavor profile. So I think if we're talking about Chardonnay styles, we can sort of start most broadly by dividing it into cool climate versus warm climate Chardonnay. And of course, as you can imagine, the warmer climate Chardonnay is probably very well exemplified by the typical Napa Chardonnay. When you think of that stereotype of the Rombauer Chardonnay, perhaps, those Chardonnays tend to be a lot more opulent, very maybe a little bit heavier on the palate. They tend to have more of an imprint from toast. They're often in barrels with a heavier toast and toasted heads. They tend to be more on the tropical spectrum aromatically. Pineapple, guava, mango. And that makes sense based on where it's growing, right? Because Napa's separated from the ocean by the Mayakama Mountains. So everything on the Napa side, on that eastern, east of us, is going to be a lot warmer. So intrinsically, it's going to lend itself to a different style. And now you can compare that to Sonoma, where we have all of this coastal real estate and it's a lot cooler. So Sonoma lends itself better to the cooler climate style of Chardonnay, which of course tends to be higher in acid, bright, zippy. It tends to be more citrus driven, a little bit more floral driven, and probably a more food friendly style in general. So that's sort of the basic two-tier system. And then within that, we winemakers can further divide Chardonnay into sort of 4 broad styles. And the first would be mineral driven. And a great example of that is Chablis. And I'm a big fan of Chablis. Brian and I love Domaine Bougreau. And you know, everybody loves Ravenot. That's sort of the hipster Chablis that everybody loves. But that sort of gives you an idea of that first style, right? That's the really mineral driven, very high acidity, the one people love with shell food. The next is sort of the fruity style of Chardonnay, and that's exemplified by the no oak style. So that Chardonnay, because it's only in stainless steel, the fruity characteristics tend to shine more brightly. And then of course you have the tropical, opulent Napa style of Chardonnay as style number 3, which is often buttery as well, which is a byproduct of the malolactic fermentation process. And sort of the 4th broad category, I think, is where I fall, and that's the barrel fermented Chardonnay. So that one tends to have some roundness on the palate. And as soon as I'm done talking about this, I'm going to get to that question. And we have the picture from Brian. So as I said, I am exemplified by the barrel fermented Chardonnay, which starts with a high acid, bright vineyard like Heintz, but we build the mouthfeel through lots of stirring and lots of batonnage. And here you can see a picture of me with Le Baton, B-A-T-O-N, inside one of my barrels of Chardonnay. And by stirring it, we resuspend the yeast. And when you resuspend the yeast, in theory, they break down and their guts come out, and their guts are actually composed of manoproteins. And those manoproteins link together to give us the velvety texture and the roundness that you get on the palate. Being on the lees like that is also protective and helps protect against oxidation. But I really do think that my Chardonnay falls into this barrel fermented style. Perfect. Were there any questions that came in? Perfect. Okay, so now we can go back to Brady Bunch style. And I thought I'd spend just a few minutes diving into some of the things that make my wine unique as a Chardonnay, as well as specifically reflective of the Heintz Vineyard. So Charlie's Vineyard sits way out in West County, as you saw on that map. It is very wet, it is very foggy, and it is very cool. It's unusual to get through a growing season out there where it hasn't been sprinkled on twice. We may not be getting actual rain at Torrey Hill where we are in the Russian River, further east in the Russian River. But Charlie, even if it's not rain, it's a maritime layer that's so thick and so heavy, it's almost like a precipitation. So it's very, very cool out there. And as you hear me talk about all the time, when it's cool, that means the grapes retain their malic acid. So Charlie's Vineyard is really unique and really special because it comes in intrinsically with a really, really high level of acidity. And there's 2 main acids that we get in grapes that we talk about, tartaric and malic. And it's unusual for those 2 types of acid to be almost 50-50. Usually there's a lot more tartaric than malic. But in Charlie's Vineyard, being cool and just being in the site, it's almost 50-50, and it gives it a lot of brightness. And if it didn't go through malolactic fermentation 100%, it would almost be too acidic, which is why throughout the winemaking process, the things that I do and the conscious choices that I make are meant to highlight that beautiful acidity while also building texture and palate and mid palate that gives it a sense of roundness so it's not bitingly acidic. And I do that in a number of ways. So the first way that I do that is with yeast selection. And I think there's a picture of me adding yeast to barrels. So we'll pop that up as we talk a little bit about yeast and Chardonnay. So there you go. So the yeast that I selected for the Chardonnay, it happens to be called VL2. But the reason that I picked it is, number one, it helps support the beautiful floral aromatics, especially if you can keep it fermented at a lower temperature. So as I said, I try to peak at like 70 degrees, and I do that by moving it in and out of the cold room. You also don't want it to stick. As I said, you need to keep it warm at the tail, but I'm very conscious every day at where I am in the curve of fermentation and what the temperature is doing and looking ahead. Should I keep it in the cold room overnight, or should I move it back out into the winery? The other interesting point about VL2 is it tends to be a yeast that supports manoprotein and glycerol production. So again, those are two components of texture and mouthfeel that are gonna help round out the acidity. All right, so, and now we can go back to Brady Bunch mode. And the other way that I do that is through barrel choices. And so a lot of people will smell this wine and taste this wine, and they'll say, wow, it's so floral, it's so pretty, it doesn't smell oaky. This was fermented in a barrel? No way. 30% new? Are you kidding me? This doesn't smell toasty. And again, that's a conscious decision. It's entirely by design. The two barrels that I use on my Chardonnay are not traditional Chardonnay barrels. Neither of them are. The first one is from a cooper called Vineyard, and it's the Ivoire barrel. And basically all you need to know that means is Ivoire means it's sort of steam bent as opposed to toast. So the idea with those barrels is to lift the palate and to give it roundness without giving it that imprint of oak, because I really wanted the fruit to shine through. That was important to me. And the other barrel that I decided to use is something called the Taranceau Grand Chauffe Toast. And again, it's not necessarily a traditional Chardonnay barrel. And I actually would have never thought to use it. So the first year I was making Chardonnay was 2017. And as you can guess, no wine, I shouldn't say no wine, perhaps Napa Cabernet, but it's a rare wine that can tolerate 100% new oak without tasting like a 2x4 from Home Depot. So anytime you're starting making your first wine, obviously the easiest barrels to find are new barrels, right? Like coopers want to sell you new stuff, it's really expensive. It's harder to find barrels that have been used once or barrels that have been used twice. And of course, it's super easy to find really old barrels that are in generally crummy condition and don't impart anything to the wine, and you may not know what condition they're in. So I was in a bit of a pickle in 2017. As I told you, I finally got the CFNO to agree that it would be okay for me to try out making Chardonnay. And you know, if you know my husband, if you know the CFNO, he's put the kibosh on Marsanne Roussanne in a concrete egg. He has put the kibosh on port, which I push every year. Every year I try to convince him to make port. But he finally relented on the Chardonnay. So it was easy to buy new barrels, but it was hard to get once used. So I turned to my dear friends, Jeff and Bibiana Pizzoni, and said, oh my God, I'm getting fruit for Chardonnay tomorrow. Please, can you help me? And of course, as always, they came through in a pinch. And the barrel that they gave me was a once used Taranceau Grand Chauffe Toast. And I just loved it. And it was so delicious and it smelled so aromatic. It smelled Heinzy yet lifted, that I decided to keep that as part of my program to make it sort of unique and to give my unique winemaker stamp to this vineyard. The other barrel, the Vineyard barrel, is born of the fact that I was late to the party. I actually had originally wanted a different barrel. A barrel from Vineyard that's a more traditional Chardonnay choice, but they didn't have it. So I emailed Christy at Vineyard, you know, in a huff, what do you have? What do you have? I buy from you every year. She's like, yeah, but you buy like 2 barrels. Like William Sellium buys like 100. So I don't really have that much play. And she says, well, I've got this Ivoire barrel. It's a Sauvignon Blanc barrel, but it's a really nice barrel. See what you think. I said, well, I'm desperate. Fruit's coming tomorrow, so bring it over. As it turns out, I love it. And it's wonderful because as a new barrel, again, it gives you that mid palate and it gives you some of that fullness and lift without giving it the oaky imprint. Well, fast forward to this year, there was actually a really interesting academic paper published that one of the best ways that you can prevent oxidation in your Chardonnay is by using a Vineyard medium tannin potential barrel. And wouldn't you know, that's exactly the barrel that I Forrest Gumped into when Christy had nothing else to sell me. So that was kind of a fun fact that came to fruition. And obviously, as you can imagine, when you're making Chardonnay, nobody wants their wine to be oxidized because we always want it to have that beautiful color without any brownness to it. And I think that is the bulk of topics that I wanted to cover for you guys today. I had a wonderful question about soil. So yes, everybody knows that the soil in Burgundy is full of minerals. And we don't have exactly that kind of soil here. The soil at Heintz is known as the Gold Ridge soil, and it's known for being really rich. It's predominantly centered in the Green Acres part of the Russian River Valley. And then Charlie also has areas with sandy, loamy soil. So I wish we had the same kind of minerality that you get in Burgundy. And I'm not a soil expert. I can only tell you that it's the gold loam soils and the sandy loamy soils. But sometimes I think that some of the other choices that we make in terms of barrels, when we pick, the acidity in picking can help us to be what I like to call Burgundy aspirational. So obviously we're not Burgundy. We get way too much sunshine and happily we don't get the hail, but we can sort of aspire towards that style of Chardonnay. Let's see, are there any other questions out there? What do I smell and taste? Yeah. So let's talk about the Heintz. I gotta pour some more. Hold on, give me a sec here. So someone asked me to sort of break down the aromatics on this wine specifically. So for me, now that it's open, I definitely get a floral component, and I'm not good enough to separate it out. But to me, I just sort of put it into the white flower category for me, which is like, you know, maybe jasmine, I think about a lot. With the 2017 vintage specifically, I thought a lot about citrus blossoms because we have a lot of citrus trees in our backyard with Meyer lemon, and sort of that combination of floral and sort of sweet citrus at the same time. I get a little tiny bit of almost like a hazelnut, a nut, almost that, the rind, that thin paper around a nut. Like a hint of that hazelnut or like a marzipan. And obviously that comes from the barrel. On the palate, I get a little bit in the 18, a little bit more tree fruit. In the 17, I get a little bit more citrus on the palate. And of course, in every vintage, I get the acidity that rolls through from start to finish, which is so lifting and sort of causes your mouth to increase in saliva, which is the thing that makes it so good for being food friendly. Awesome. All right, guys. Well, any other questions you guys want to type in? I talked at you for a very long time today. Raise your hand. If you have a question, raise your hand because Brian can see you in Brady Bunch mode. Brian's looking around. My sound engineer in the back. Oh, Bruce has a question.
I typed it on the chat. I was just curious. We're drinking the Heintz from William Sellium, which I guess is fairly close to you. Granted, it's not the same year. I couldn't find a 2018 downstairs. But
And yours. We're
and
drinking yours
yours.
too.
Can you conjure up a taste memory of that and compare, or a stylistic difference between your winemaking and the William Selliam one?
Sure, I absolutely can. That's a great question. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, what do you think? And there's no right or wrong answer. If you see a difference between mine and theirs, and then I'll speak to it.
I actually like yours better. I find yours brighter, and I'm such an acid freak. I think it really makes the acid speak in a beautiful way.
So if you look on that William Salem label, my hunch is that for the AVA, it says Russian River Valley. What does it say?
That's correct.
Okay, so there you go. So that takes you right to the heart of the stylistic difference and what makes the Heintz Vineyard so much fun. So as I talked about before, the Heintz Vineyard straddles the AVA. So some of the vineyard is actually in the Russian River and some of the ranch is in Sonoma Coast. And Charlie is not terribly particular with us about how we choose to label it, but I think all of the winemakers like to label it in the AVA that reflects the style. So to me, the William Salem iteration, and especially if you have an older vintage that was made by my dear friend Bob Cabral, I think it's really more in a Russian River style, which tends to be a little bit more round, a little bit lower in the acidity, maybe a little bit more towards that tropical, pineapple-y sort of character. And that's for a number of reasons. William Salem picks it at a slightly higher Brix than I do. They only like to pick the morning side of, they usually do 2 sweeps. So they'll pick the morning side first. And I know this from Bob. They pick the morning side first, because that gets the most sunshine. And then they'll do a second sweep where they take the back side. Because remember, I talked about it being a double trellis, which is unusual for Sonoma. So they'll take the morning side first and go back and do a second sweep on the back side. But I think also they're using Francois Frere barrels. So they're getting a different oak imprint than I do. And they're really going for that Russian River style, which is a little bit more, it's a little bit of a fatter style. For me, I'm really trying to go for that traditional Sonoma Coast profile. So I'm really looking for lemon zest, lime zest, citrus, a really intense citrus focus. One of the producers that I really enjoy out of Heintz Vineyard is Cerritos. And you know, John and Phoebe pick super duper duper early at ridiculously high acid, so high that I'm afraid it won't go through ML. But what I really love is that acid focus and that citrus focus. It just tastes like lime zest. And to me, that's the fun of this vineyard and winemaking for Chardonnay, because you can have that Sonoma Coast style, which is like a lemon drop or a lemon head candy. And then you can also pick a little bit later and get a little bit richer Russian River style. And again, also the barrels, especially in Chardonnay, are really going to give you an imprint. And I know that William Salem uses almost exclusively Francois Frere barrels, and I don't use any on my Chardonnay. So that's a great question. Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other hand waving as we round that 45-minute mark? Alan. Okay, Brian's going to look for you. He found you. Alan, you're up.
I submitted it in chat mode to Brian, but I wanted you to please speak to the ageability of the Heintz Vineyard Chardonnay.
Absolutely. So I think as far as Chardonnays go, this is an intrinsically ageable Chardonnay just because it comes in with such a tremendously bright amount of acid. I mean, I could have put charts of acidity up for you, and I thought about that, and I thought everyone would be bored. And if I start to tell you that 7.2 grams per liter, that's awesome acid, everyone would just, you know, drop off the chat boxes. But I think the ageability really goes hand in hand with the acidity. And as you know, over time, whether it's with a red wine or a white wine, that acidity does sort of soften on its own with the intrinsic ageability and the aging process of wine aging in a barrel. I mean, aging in a bottle. So I do think this will age really, really nicely.
Thank you.
One more question from Mike. Brian's
So-
gonna unmute you.
Okay.
Oh, you're good.
It's not really a question. It's
Okay.
just an observation. When you were describing the happen chance by which you bought grapes from Heintz Vineyard, and then the story about the barrels, I think you ought to name this wine Serendipity, because it is the perfect example of serendipity, and I love it.
Thank you. Or we could call it, we all get by with some help from our friends. Because really, this is like the team making wine. Like you know, Jeff and Bibiana, obviously the Pizzonis are like Santa Lucia Highlands people, and Christy is the barrel cooper person. And you know, what are the odds that I'm standing next to a woman whose twins are the same age as my twins? I mean, really. And it's funny because we're usually done by alpha order. So the fact that B. Brulium was next to H. Heintz was super duper random too. Because we're usually next to, like, I don't know, Bonovia. I'm always next to Bonovia, Brulium and BE. So yes, serendipity and friendship circle.
Absolutely.
All right, well guys, we are about to hit the 45-minute mark. One quick thing. Next week's talk is going to be a webinar format. I sort of wanted to do a deep dive into Pinot Noir AVAs, looking at Russian River Valley versus Petaluma Gap versus the Santa Lucia Highlands. And I have a lot of maps and a lot of pictures. So next week, hopefully if it's okay with everybody, I thought we would just do webinar format instead of Brady Bunch, just so I can show you all the pictures that I want to show you. And with that, I say cheers. I say be well, stay well, drink well, everybody, and thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kerith.
Thanks, everybody.